The jungle doesn't choose sides. It doesn't care about your rank, your training, or how many missions you've survived. When 12 elite soldiers entered those dense, unforgiving woods on what should have been a routine patrol, they carried with them years of experience, advanced equipment, and unshakable confidence. But the jungle had other plans. By dawn, only one heartbeat remained among the twisted vines and shadow-covered ground. This is the story of Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, the lone survivor of Operation Nightfall, and the 18 hours that changed everything he thought he knew about survival, loyalty, and what it truly means to make it home. The morning mist clung to the helicopter's rotors as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen checked his rifle for the third time. Around him, 11 other soldiers made their final preparations, their faces painted in green and black camouflage that made them look like ancient warriors preparing for battle. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter blades created a hypnotic soundtrack to what everyone expected would be another routine reconnaissance mission. Chen had been on dozens of similar operations during his 8-year military career. At 29, he was neither the oldest nor the youngest in the squad, but he had earned respect through consistent performance and level-headed decision-making under pressure. His teammates called him steady because of his calm demeanor, even when situations went sideways. Lieutenant Rodriguez, their commanding officer, shouted over the engine noise, "Remember, we're looking for enemy supply routes through the northern corridor. Intelligence suggests increased activity in the past 2 weeks. We go in quiet, gather information, and extract at dawn. Simple in and out." The helicopter began its descent toward a small clearing about 3 miles from their target area. Through the open door, Chen could see the dense canopy below, an endless sea of green that seemed to stretch forever. The jungle looked peaceful from above, but he knew better. Down there, every shadow could hide danger. Every sound could mean the difference between life and death. Sergeant Williams, the squad's demolitions expert, nudged Chen with his elbow. "Easy money today, steady. We'll be back in time for breakfast." Williams was known for his optimism and his ability to find humor in any situation. He had a photograph of his newborn daughter taped inside his helmet, and he never failed to mention how this would be his last deployment before requesting a transfer to a training position. The helicopter touched down with barely a whisper, testament to the pilot's skill. One by one, the soldiers rappelled down into the clearing, their boots barely making a sound as they hit the soft jungle floor. Within minutes, the helicopter disappeared into the morning sky, leaving them alone in the vast wilderness. Chen felt the familiar mixture of alertness and calm that came with the beginning of a mission. The jungle immediately enveloped them in its humid embrace, and the sounds of civilization vanished completely. Instead, they were surrounded by the symphony of nature, birds calling from invisible perches, insects buzzing in complex harmonies, and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. The squad moved in standard formation, with Rodriguez taking point and Chen positioned third in line. They had trained together for months, and their movements were synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Each soldier knew his role, his position, and his responsibilities without needing verbal communication. As they pushed deeper into the jungle, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Thick vines hung like natural barriers, forcing them to duck and weave through passages that seemed designed to slow human progress. The ground beneath their feet was soft and treacherous, covered with decades of fallen leaves that created a spongy carpet hiding roots, holes, and other obstacles. 2 hours into their march, they reached their first checkpoint. Rodriguez called for a brief rest, and the soldiers took positions in a defensive circle while he consulted his map and GPS device. The technology looked alien against the primitive backdrop of the ancient forest, a reminder of the modern world they had temporarily left behind. Private Johnson, the youngest member of their squad at just 19, was struggling with the humidity. Sweat poured down his face despite the relatively cool morning temperature, and his breathing was slightly labored. Chen moved closer to him, offering his water bottle without saying a word. Johnson nodded gratefully and took a small sip, careful to conserve the precious resource. The jungle around them was alive with movement, though most of it remained invisible. Occasionally, a colorful bird would dart between branches overhead, or a small animal would rustle through the underbrush nearby. Chen had learned to distinguish between natural sounds and potentially dangerous ones but it required constant attention and experience that couldn't be taught in any classroom. As they prepared to continue their mission, Corporal Martinez reported something unusual through his radio headset. He was monitoring enemy communications frequencies and had detected increased chatter in the past 30 minutes. The intercepted conversations were in a local dialect that none of them understood fluently, but the tone and frequency suggested heightened activity. Rodriguez made the decision to proceed with extra caution. The mission parameters remained the same, but their approach would be modified to account for the possibility of increased enemy presence in the area. They would move more slowly, take longer breaks to listen and observe, and maintain stricter noise discipline. The next phase of their journey took them through particularly dense vegetation. At times, visibility was reduced to just a few yards in any direction. The canopy above was so thick that very little sunlight penetrated to the ground level, creating a perpetual twilight atmosphere that played tricks on the eyes and mind. Chen found himself thinking about home as they walked. His mother had sent him a package the previous week containing homemade cookies and a letter filled with neighborhood gossip and family news. It was strange how such ordinary details could seem so precious when filtered through the lens of military life. His younger sister was starting college in the fall, and his father was finally considering retirement after 30 years of working at the same factory. These thoughts were interrupted when the soldier ahead of him suddenly raised his fist, the universal signal to freeze and maintain absolute silence. Everyone in the squad instantly became motionless, their training taking over without conscious thought. Chen's heart rate increased slightly, but his breathing remained controlled and quiet. Through the foliage ahead, voices could be heard speaking in the local language. Rodriguez slowly moved forward to get a better view while the rest of the squad maintained their positions. After several tense minutes, he returned and used hand signals to communicate what he had observed. A group of enemy soldiers was moving through the jungle approximately 50 yards ahead of their position. Rodriguez had counted at least 8 individuals, all armed and moving in a coordinated formation that suggested military training. Their route would intersect with the squad's planned path, creating a potential confrontation that could compromise the entire mission. The textbook solution would be to wait for the enemy group to pass, then continue with their original plan. However, the intelligence value of observing enemy movements and possibly identifying supply routes made the situation more complicated. Rodriguez had to weigh the risks and benefits of several possible courses of action. After consulting with his senior sergeants, including Chen, Rodriguez decided to shadow the enemy group from a safe distance. If they could observe without being detected, they might gather valuable information about enemy operations in the area. It was a calculated risk, but one that fell within their mission parameters. The next 2 hours were among the most stressful of Chen's military career. Moving silently through dense jungle while maintaining visual contact with potentially hostile forces required every skill he had developed over years of training and experience. One snapped branch, one careless footstep, or one piece of equipment reflecting sunlight could turn their reconnaissance mission into a firefight. The enemy group seemed to know the terrain intimately, following paths that were invisible to Chen's eyes but clearly well established in their minds. They moved with the confidence of people who belonged in this environment, while Chen and his teammates had to constantly adapt to obstacles and challenges that their adversaries navigated effortlessly. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the enemy soldiers were heading toward a specific destination rather than conducting a random patrol. Their pace was steady and purposeful, and they made several course corrections that suggested familiarity with local landmarks that weren't visible to the following Americans. The sun was beginning to set when the enemy group finally reached their apparent destination. Through careful observation from a concealed position, Chen and his teammates discovered a well-camouflaged enemy camp that hadn't appeared on any of their intelligence maps. The facility was larger than expected, with multiple structures hidden beneath natural and artificial camouflage. Rodriguez realized they had stumbled upon something significant. The camp appeared to be a major logistics hub, with supplies and equipment visible even from their distant observation point. This was exactly the kind of intelligence their mission was designed to uncover, but it also represented a much larger enemy presence than they had been prepared to encounter. The decision to withdraw and report their findings should have been straightforward, but Rodriguez was ambitious and saw an opportunity to gather even more valuable intelligence. As darkness fell, he proposed a closer reconnaissance of the enemy facility, arguing that the cover of night would allow them to get better information without being detected. Chen felt uneasy about the plan, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. His instincts told him that they had already pushed their luck far enough, and that discretion would be the better part of valor in this situation. However, he also understood the potential value of the intelligence they might gather, and Rodriguez was the commanding officer. The squad spent an hour preparing for their night reconnaissance. They applied fresh camouflage paint, checked their equipment for anything that might reflect light or make noise, and reviewed their emergency procedures. Each soldier would have specific responsibilities and contingency plans if things went wrong. As they prepared to move closer to the enemy camp, Chen took a moment to write a brief message in his field notebook. It was something he had started doing before particularly dangerous operations, a way of leaving some record of his thoughts and feelings in case something happened. The message was simple. If anyone reads this, tell my family I was thinking of them and that I tried to do the right thing. The approach to the enemy camp took over an hour, with the squad moving in single file and stopping frequently to listen and observe. The jungle at night was a completely different environment, filled with sounds and shadows that played tricks on the senses. Every rustle could be wind or an enemy sentry. Every shadow could hide a threat or be nothing more than imagination. When they finally reached their observation position, the intelligence value of their discovery became even more apparent. The enemy camp was clearly a major operational center, with communication equipment, supply depots, and what appeared to be planning facilities. The information they were gathering could potentially save many American lives by revealing enemy capabilities and intentions. However, their presence had not gone completely unnoticed. As Chen watched through his night vision scope, he saw movement that didn't match the patterns they had observed earlier. Enemy sentries appeared to be more alert, and there seemed to be additional personnel moving through the camp in ways that suggested heightened security. The realization that they might have been detected came too late to prevent what happened next. The jungle erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireworks. The carefully planned reconnaissance mission had become a fight for survival, and Chen knew that everything he had learned in 8 years of military service was about to be put to the ultimate test. The first burst of enemy fire sent Chen diving behind a fallen log that felt too small to protect anything larger than a rabbit. Bullets whined overhead and thudded into the trees around him, sending splinters of bark raining down like deadly confetti. The peaceful jungle of moments before had transformed into a war zone where every shadow could conceal death. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, trying to maintain command and control despite the chaos. Fall back to Rally Point Alpha. Move in pairs, covering fire. Go, go, go. But his words were nearly drowned out by the increasing volume of gunfire from multiple directions. It was becoming clear that they hadn't just been detected. They had walked into a carefully prepared trap. Chen rolled to his right, seeking better cover behind a massive tree trunk. As he moved, he saw Private Johnson frozen in the open, his young face pale with terror in the strobing light of muzzle flashes. Without thinking, Chen sprinted toward the younger soldier, grabbing him by the equipment harness and hauling him toward safety just as a line of bullets chewed up the ground where Johnson had been standing. "Stay with me, kid!" Chen shouted over the noise, pressing Johnson down behind their makeshift shelter. "Remember your training. Breathe, aim, fire. We're getting out of this." Johnson nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he tried to ready his weapon. The enemy had positioned themselves expertly, using the natural terrain and their knowledge of the area to create interlocking fields of fire. Every direction seemed to offer nothing but more danger. Sergeant Williams was 30 yards to their left, his demolitions pack making him a particularly valuable target. Corporal Martinez was somewhere to the right, but Chen couldn't see him through the maze of vegetation and gunfire. As Chen assessed their situation, he realized with growing dread that this wasn't a chance encounter or even a response to their discovery of the camp. The enemy positions were too well coordinated, too perfectly placed. Someone had known they were coming, or at least had prepared for the possibility of American reconnaissance in this area. A grenade exploded 20 yards away, close enough to shower them with dirt and debris, but not close enough to cause serious injury. The concussion left Chen's ears ringing, but it also revealed something important. The enemy was trying to drive them in a specific direction rather than simply destroying them where they lay. This was a hunting party, not a defensive response. "Johnson, we need to move," Chen said, having to shout to be heard over his temporary hearing loss. "When I give the signal, run toward that cluster of rocks. I'll cover you." Johnson's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded his understanding. Chen rose slightly and began firing controlled bursts toward the nearest enemy muzzle flashes. His years of training took over and muscle memory guided his actions, even as his conscious mind struggled to process the overwhelming sensory input of combat. The familiar weight of his rifle, the pattern of breathing between shots, the routine of changing magazines. These automatic actions provided stability in the chaos. Johnson made his dash successfully, sliding behind the rocks just as enemy fire began tracking his movement. Chen waited for a lull in the incoming fire, then sprinted after him, diving headfirst into their new position just as bullets began impacting where he had been standing. From their new location, Chen could see more of the battlefield. What he observed made his blood run cold. Enemy soldiers were moving through the jungle with the confidence of hunters who had cornered their prey. They advanced in coordinated bounds, one group providing covering fire while another moved forward. These weren't irregular fighters or militia, they were professional soldiers executing a well-rehearsed plan. Rodriguez's voice came through the radio again, but now he sounded wounded. "Charlie team, what's your status? We need to consolidate and break contact. This is bigger than we thought." Chen tried to respond, but his radio had been damaged during his last dash for cover. He and Johnson were effectively cut off from the rest of the squad. The sound of gunfire began to change, becoming more sporadic but also more precise. Chen realized that the enemy was systematically eliminating his teammates, using their superior numbers and knowledge of the terrain to isolate and destroy individual soldiers. The professional nature of the attack suggested this wasn't just a local military unit. It was a specialized hunter-killer team. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the jungle, cut short by a burst of automatic weapons fire. Chen felt his stomach clench as he recognized the voice as belonging to Sergeant Williams, the demolitions expert who had been joking about easy money and breakfast just hours earlier was now dead somewhere in the darkness. "We have to help them," Johnson whispered, his young face streaked with sweat and dirt. Chen understood the impulse. Every instinct screamed at him to fight back, to rescue his teammates, to do something other than hide behind rocks while his friends were being killed. But his experience told him that rushing blindly into the darkness would only add 2 more casualties to the enemy's count. "Listen to me carefully," Chen said, grabbing Johnson by the shoulders. "Our job now is to survive and report what we've learned. If we get killed trying to be heroes, nobody will know what happened here. Our families will never get answers, and other American soldiers might walk into the same trap." Another explosion lit up the jungle, this one much closer. The enemy was using grenades to flush out any remaining American positions, methodically clearing the area section by section. Chen realized they had perhaps minutes before the search reached their hiding spot. He began planning their escape route, using his mental map of the area they had traveled during the day. The jungle was thick in all directions, but there had been a small stream about half a mile to the southeast. If they could reach it, the water might help mask their scent, and the terrain might provide better concealment options. The firing began to die down, replaced by voices speaking in the local dialect. Chen couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested organization and control rather than the excitement of ongoing combat. The hunters were regrouping, probably preparing to search for survivors and collect intelligence from the bodies of his fallen teammates. "When I give the word, we're going to crawl backwards very slowly," Chen whispered to Johnson. "Stay low, move only when the shadows move, and don't make any sound. We're going to work our way toward that stream we crossed this afternoon." They began their agonizingly slow withdrawal, moving inches at a time through the undergrowth. Every sound seemed amplified in the relative quiet that had fallen over the jungle. Chen's knees and elbows were soon raw from crawling over roots and rocks, but he ignored the pain and focused on maintaining silent movement. Behind them, flashlight beams began probing the darkness as enemy soldiers started their systematic search of the battle area. Chen could hear them talking to each other as they moved, their voices casual and professional. They were searching for survivors with the same methodical approach they had used in the ambush. The escape took over 2 hours, with frequent stops to remain motionless while enemy patrols passed nearby. Several times Chen was certain they had been discovered, holding his breath as footsteps approached their hiding spot before moving on. Johnson handled the stress better than Chen had expected, following instructions precisely and maintaining the discipline necessary for their survival. When they finally reached the stream, both soldiers were exhausted and dehydrated, despite the humid jungle air. The water was cool and clear, and Chen had to resist the urge to drink deeply. Instead, he used his water purification tablets and filled their canteens, knowing they would need the liquid for whatever lay ahead.
"Are we safe now?" Johnson whispered as they crouched beside the flowing water. Chen wished he could offer reassurance, but honesty seemed more important at this moment.
"We're alive," he replied quietly. "But they'll be looking for us." Professional soldiers don't usually leave survivors, especially when there's intelligence at stake. "We need to keep moving and stay ahead of their search parties." They followed the stream downstream, walking in the water to avoid leaving tracks and to mask their scent from any tracking dogs the enemy might employ. The current was gentle, and the rocky stream bed provided reasonably good footing despite the darkness. As dawn began to break, Chen realized they faced a new set of challenges. Daylight would make them more visible, but would also allow them to navigate more effectively. Their biggest problem was that they were deep in enemy territory with no communication equipment and no clear extraction plan. The original mission called for helicopter pickup at dawn, but that rendezvous point was back near the enemy camp where his entire squad had been ambushed. Chen had to assume that the pickup would be scrubbed when the squad failed to make contact, but he also knew that search and rescue operations would eventually be launched. His job was to keep himself and Johnson alive long enough to be found, while also gathering as much intelligence as possible about the enemy force they had encountered. The information about the camp and the professional military unit operating in the area could be crucial for future American operations. They found a concealed position overlooking a small clearing, where they could observe the surrounding area while remaining hidden. Chen used his remaining daylight to study their situation and plan their next moves. The stream continued southeast for several miles before joining a larger river that eventually connected to areas under American control. The jungle around them showed signs of regular human traffic, not the heavy usage that would indicate a major route, but enough to suggest that enemy forces moved through this area regularly. Chen made mental notes of everything he observed, knowing that this intelligence might be valuable if they survived to report it. As the day progressed, they began to hear the distinctive sound of helicopters in the distance. American search and rescue operations had begun, but the aircraft were too far away to signal safely. Chen knew that any attempt to make contact might also alert enemy forces to their location. Johnson was holding up well physically, but Chen could see the psychological strain beginning to show. The young soldier had watched his first combat mission turn into a nightmare, seeing teammates killed and finding himself stranded in hostile territory with minimal survival training. Chen felt responsible for keeping the kids' morale up along with his own. "Tell me about home," Chen said during one of their rest periods. "What did you do before you enlisted?" The conversation seemed to help Johnson focus on something other than their current situation, and Chen learned that the young man had grown up on a farm in Iowa, working with his hands and dreaming of seeing the world. As evening approached, they heard voices coming from upstream. Enemy patrols were still searching for them, probably following the same logical escape route that Chen had chosen. Their hunters were persistent and professional, showing the kind of dedication that suggested this operation was important to them. Chen made the decision to leave the stream and head cross-country toward the larger river. It would be more difficult navigation, but it might throw off their pursuers and get them closer to friendly territory. As they prepared to move deeper into the hostile jungle, Chen wondered how many of his teammates had survived the ambush, and whether anyone else was making a similar desperate journey through the darkness. The night brought new terrors that Chen hadn't anticipated. As they moved away from the stream and deeper into unmarked jungle territory, the sounds of pursuit seemed to follow them like a persistent nightmare. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, every distant voice speaking in that unfamiliar dialect reminded them that professional soldiers were hunting them with the patience and skill of apex predators. Johnson was beginning to show signs of serious fatigue. The young soldier had been running on adrenaline and fear for over 12 hours, and his body was starting to rebel against the constant stress. His movements were becoming less coordinated, and Chen noticed him stumbling more frequently over obstacles that should have been easy to navigate. "We need to find a place to rest," Chen whispered as they paused beside a massive fallen tree. The trunk was so large that it created a natural shelter, with enough space underneath for both of them to lie flat and remain completely hidden from casual observation. But only for a couple of hours. We can't stay in one place too long. They crawled beneath the fallen giant, and Chen immediately felt some of the tension leave his body. For the first time since the ambush began, they had solid protection above them and enough concealment to risk a few minutes of true rest. Johnson collapsed almost immediately, his exhaustion finally overcoming his fear. Chen forced himself to stay alert, listening to the jungle sounds around them while his companions slept. The forest at night was alive with creatures he couldn't identify, their calls and movements creating a complex symphony that helped mask any sounds the two soldiers might make. But Chen had learned to distinguish between natural jungle sounds and the subtle disturbances that indicated human presence. Around midnight, he heard what he had been dreading, the methodical sound of a search party moving through the forest nearby, voices speaking in low, disciplined tones, the careful placement of footsteps, and the occasional metallic click of military equipment. The enemy hadn't given up their hunt, and they were close enough that Chen could occasionally make out individual words, even though he couldn't understand their meaning. He gently shook Johnson awake, placing a hand over the young soldier's mouth to prevent any involuntary sound. Johnson's eyes opened wide with instant alertness, the kind of response that only comes from extended periods of mortal danger. Chen pointed toward the sounds of the approaching search party and held up his hand to indicate they needed to remain absolutely silent. The enemy patrol passed within 20 feet of their hiding place. Chen could see the beams of their flashlights probing through the jungle canopy, and at one point, a boot stepped on a branch so close that he could have reached out and touched it. The hunters were thorough and professional, checking every potential hiding spot with the kind of systematic approach that suggested extensive training in tracking and counterinsurgency operations. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the search party moved on. Chen waited another 30 minutes before allowing himself to believe they were temporarily safe. The close encounter had demonstrated just how skilled their pursuers were, and Chen realized that conventional evasion techniques might not be enough to escape this particular enemy. "We need to change our approach," he whispered to Johnson once he was confident the search party was out of earshot. "They're too good at tracking, and they know this terrain better than we do. We need to think like prey animals instead of soldiers." Chen had grown up hunting with his father in the mountains of Colorado, and those childhood experiences had taught him lessons about animal behavior that weren't covered in military training. Prey animals survived by being unpredictable, by using terrain features in unexpected ways, and by remaining motionless when hunters were nearby, rather than always trying to stay ahead of them. They spent the remaining hours before dawn moving in a completely different pattern. Instead of trying to maintain steady progress toward friendly territory, they began moving in seemingly random directions, doubling back on their own trail, and using natural features to confuse anyone trying to track their path. It was slower and more exhausting, but Chen hoped it would make them harder to predict and follow. As the first light of dawn filtered through the jungle canopy, they found themselves on a small ridge overlooking a valley where smoke was rising from what appeared to be another enemy camp. The facility was smaller than the one they had discovered the previous day, but it was clearly active and well defended. Chen realized they had stumbled into an area that was much more heavily occupied by enemy forces than their intelligence had suggested. "How many camps do you think there are?" Johnson asked quietly as they observed the scene below. Chen had been wondering the same thing, and the implications were troubling. If the enemy had established multiple permanent facilities in this area, it suggested a level of organization and territorial control that posed serious threats to American operations throughout the region. "Enough to make our information very valuable," Chen replied. "If we can get back and report what we've seen, it might prevent other squads from walking into similar ambushes." The responsibility of survival was beginning to weigh on him. They weren't just trying to save their own lives anymore. They were the only witnesses to enemy capabilities and positions that could affect many future operations. They were forced to make a wide detour around the valley, adding several hours to their journey but avoiding detection by the soldiers at the facility below. The extra distance took them through some of the most challenging terrain they had yet encountered, with steep slopes, thick vegetation, and treacherous footing that required constant attention to avoid injury. By midday, both soldiers were suffering from dehydration and exhaustion. Their water supplies were running low, and the physical and emotional stress of the past 18 hours was taking a serious toll. Johnson was beginning to show signs of heat exhaustion, and Chen realized they would need to find water and shelter soon or risk becoming casualties of the environment rather than enemy action. They found salvation in the form of a small spring hidden beneath a rock overhang. The water was clear and cold, bubbling up from some underground source that had probably sustained jungle wildlife for thousands of years. Chen tested it carefully before allowing them to drink, knowing that waterborne illness could be as deadly as enemy bullets in their current situation. The rock overhang provided excellent concealment and natural cooling, making it an ideal place to rest during the hottest part of the day. Chen decided to risk a longer stop, reasoning that they needed to recover some strength before continuing their journey. Johnson fell asleep almost immediately, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Chen used the time to think through their situation and options. They were still deep in enemy territory, with limited supplies and no communication equipment. Their best hope was to continue moving toward the larger river, where they might encounter friendly forces or at least find a way to signal for extraction. But the journey would take at least another day, assuming they didn't encounter more enemy patrols. The sound of helicopters in the distance interrupted his planning. American aircraft were conducting search and rescue operations, but they were too far away to reach safely. Chen knew that any attempt to signal them would also alert enemy forces to their location, potentially bringing down more hunters than rescuers. As afternoon turned to evening, they heard voices approaching their hiding spot. Another enemy patrol was working its way through the area, and their systematic search pattern suggested they were getting closer to finding the two American soldiers. Chen woke Johnson quietly and prepared for another period of absolute stillness and silence. This patrol was larger than the previous ones, with at least 6 voices speaking in the local dialect. They were also more thorough, taking time to examine potential hiding spots that earlier searchers had passed by quickly. Chen realized that the enemy was escalating their efforts, probably bringing in additional resources and more experienced trackers. The patrol discovered their earlier resting spot beneath the fallen tree, and Chen could hear excited conversation as they examined the evidence of human presence. The hunters had found their trail, and Chen knew their systematic approach would eventually lead them to the spring where he and Johnson were currently hiding. "We have to move now," Chen whispered urgently. "They've found our trail, and they'll be here within the hour." Johnson nodded, his face pale but determined. The young soldier had learned quickly during their ordeal, and he now moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every mistake could be fatal. They slipped away from the spring just as the sun was setting, beginning another night of desperate movement through hostile territory. The enemy patrol reached their former hiding spot less than 30 minutes later, close enough that Chen could hear their frustrated conversations when they realized their quarry had escaped again. The chase continued through the darkness, with the two Americans staying barely ahead of their pursuers. Chen's military training and hunting experience were being tested to their absolute limits, and he found himself drawing on every survival skill he had ever learned. They moved like ghosts through the jungle, using every shadow and every sound to avoid detection. Around midnight, they reached the edge of a larger river that Chen recognized from their mission maps. The water was moving faster than the stream they had followed earlier, and the opposite bank was several hundred yards away through what appeared to be a strong current. But crossing the river would put them in territory that was closer to American control, and the water would definitely break their trail for any tracking dogs. Johnson looked at the dark water with obvious apprehension. "I'm not a strong swimmer," he admitted quietly. "Growing up on a farm in Iowa doesn't exactly prepare you for river crossings." Chen felt a surge of protective responsibility for the younger soldier who had become his companion in this nightmare. "We'll cross together," Chen assured him. "I'll help you every step of the way." They spent precious minutes preparing for the crossing, securing their equipment and planning their approach to minimize the time they would be exposed and vulnerable in the water. The river crossing became the most terrifying experience of their entire ordeal. The current was stronger than it had appeared from the bank, and the water was cold enough to quickly sap their strength. Johnson struggled almost immediately, and Chen found himself supporting both their weights while fighting the river's attempt to sweep them downstream into unknown dangers. Halfway across, Chen heard shouts from the bank they had just left. The enemy patrol had reached the river and discovered them in the middle of their crossing. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets began impacting the water around them, some close enough to send up small fountains of spray. Chen made a desperate decision to dive beneath the surface, pulling Johnson down with him and allowing the current to carry them downstream while they held their breath. The underwater world was dark and disorienting, but it provided protection from the gunfire above. When they finally surfaced, gasping and choking, they were several hundred yards downstream and apparently out of immediate danger. They dragged themselves onto the far bank, exhausted and hypothermic, but alive. Johnson was barely conscious, and Chen had to help him move away from the water's edge to avoid being spotted by enemy soldiers who might be paralleling their movement from the opposite bank. As dawn broke on their second day in the jungle, Chen could hear the distant sound of American helicopters conducting expanded search operations. They had survived the night and the river crossing, but they were still deep in hostile territory with dwindling supplies and failing strength. The hunt was continuing, and Chen knew their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. Johnson looked at him with eyes that had aged years in just 2 days. "Do you think we're going to make it home, Sergeant?" Chen met the young soldier's gaze and saw his own determination reflected there, despite everything they had endured. "We've made it this far, soldier," Chen replied with more confidence than he felt. "We're going to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep surviving until somebody finds us or we find our way back to friendly territory. That's what soldiers do." As they prepared to continue their journey, Chen realized that his words weren't just encouragement for Johnson. They were a promise he was making to himself, to his fallen teammates, and to everyone who was counting on them to bring home the intelligence that had cost so many lives to gather. The jungle stretched ahead of them, still dangerous and still full of enemies. But Chen felt a grim determination settling over him. He had become the sole witness to an enemy operation that threatened American lives, and he would not let his teammates' sacrifice be meaningless. Whatever it took, however long it took, he was going to survive long enough to tell their story.